The moment that changed everything didn't start with chaos or shouting. It started with silence. A quiet airport lounge, a perfectly normal boarding process, and a flight that was supposed to be routine. But inside that silence, something deeply uncomfortable was already forming. Because on that day, a decision was made that would later shake an entire airline to its core. A decision so small at first, yet so powerful in consequence that even the CEO would wish he could turn back time. The airport was busy as always. First-class passengers were being welcomed with smiles, priority boarding, and the kind of attention that separates luxury from the rest of the world. Everything looked perfect on the surface. Polished floors reflected soft lighting. Flight announcements echoed calmly through the terminal. And passengers, dressed in expensive clothes and carrying designer luggage, moved toward their gate with quiet confidence. No one expected anything unusual. Especially not on this flight. Among those passengers was a man who didn't attract attention at first glance. He was calm, composed, and dressed simply. Nothing about him screamed importance, and that was exactly why no one paid him much attention. He boarded like everyone else, walked into the first-class section, and took his seat without hesitation. He wasn't loud. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply sat there with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years in high-pressure environments where control matters more than words. But what nobody realized at that moment was that this man was not just another passenger. He was a highly trained airline pilot, a man who had spent thousands of hours in the sky, responsible for hundreds of lives at a time. A professional trusted with aircraft worth millions. Someone who understood aviation better than most people in that cabin ever would. Yet none of that mattered in the next few minutes, because perception was about to overpower truth. As boarding continued, a flight attendant walked down the aisle. Her expression was neutral at first, routine even. But when her eyes landed on the man sitting in the first-class seat, something shifted. A subtle hesitation. A quick scan of the seat number. Then a second glance at him. Something didn't match her expectation. In her mind, first class was reserved for a certain type of passenger, and this man, in her judgment, didn't fit that image. She approached him politely but firmly, asking to verify his boarding pass. The man calmly complied, handing it over without resistance. He remained composed, almost unusually calm. The flight attendant checked the ticket, then checked it again. Her expression changed slightly, but instead of confusion leading to correction, it led to doubt. She nodded, but didn't walk away immediately. Instead, she called another crew member. Now attention was slowly building around the seat. A second staff member arrived. Then a third. The atmosphere, once normal, started to feel slightly off. Passengers nearby began to notice that something was happening. Whispering started quietly. Glances were exchanged. The man in the seat still did not react emotionally. He simply waited, observing everything with a calmness that almost felt out of place in the growing tension around him. Then came the statement no passenger ever expects to hear in first class. He was told that there appeared to be a seat allocation issue and that he might need to move. At first it sounded like a mistake, something administrative. But the tone quickly changed. It was no longer a question. It was becoming an instruction, a quiet push toward something deeper. The man did not argue. He simply asked a question in a calm voice. A simple question that carried no aggression, only clarity. But instead of easing the situation, it seemed to make the staff more defensive. Now assumptions were being made. Quiet judgments were forming without being spoken aloud, and slowly something dangerous was happening. Not a technical error, but a human one. Passengers were now fully aware something was wrong. First-class cabins are usually quiet, controlled, and distant from drama. But now all eyes were subtly shifting toward one seat. The man remained composed, but the environment around him was changing rapidly. The tension was no longer hidden. And then came the moment that crossed the line. He was asked to leave the seat, not because of a confirmed error, not because of a verified issue, but because of doubt, because of assumption, because someone believed, without asking the right questions, that he did not belong there. He stood up slowly. No resistance, no argument, no emotional reaction, just silence. That silence, however, carried more weight than any protest could have, because as he picked up his belongings, the entire cabin felt something shift, a quiet discomfort, a sense that something about this situation was not right. Passengers watched as he walked down the aisle, some confused, some uncomfortable, some silently judging, but no one spoke. The staff avoided eye contact, and the man, still calm, left the first-class section without a single raised voice. But just before disappearing from view, he paused for a moment, not to create a scene, not to argue, but simply to look back. That single moment held something no one in that cabin understood yet. Not anger, not frustration, but something far more powerful. Because what no one on that flight realized was that this decision, this quiet removal, was about to trigger consequences far beyond the aircraft itself. And the truth about who he really was still waiting to be revealed. The cabin fell back into an uneasy normality after the man left the first-class section, but nothing truly felt normal anymore. The silence was different now, heavier. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from discomfort people don't know how to express. Passengers slowly returned to their seats, pretending to focus on their phones, books, or the view outside the window. But every few seconds, their eyes drifted back toward the aisle where the incident had just unfolded. Something about it didn't sit right, even if no one was ready to say it out loud. The flight attendants continued their duties, but their energy had shifted. Their movements were still professional, but slightly rigid, as if they were aware that something small had just gone wrong, yet not fully understanding how wrong it actually was. Quiet conversations began happening near the galley. Short sentences, controlled tones, glances toward the seating chart, the kind of behavior that usually signals uncertainty behind the scenes of an otherwise polished system. Meanwhile, the man who had been removed was no longer visible, but his presence was still strangely felt. It wasn't about who was sitting where anymore. It was about what had just happened and why it had happened so easily. A first-class passenger had been asked to leave based on assumption and doubt rather than certainty. And now, subtle questions were beginning to form in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Questions no one wanted to be the first to ask. At the back of the crew's mind, something wasn't adding up. The boarding pass had been valid. The seat assignment had matched. There was no obvious system error. And yet, the decision had already been made and acted upon. In aviation, mistakes are serious, but rushed corrections without confirmation can be even worse. That realization started to sink in slowly among the staff, replacing confidence with quiet concern. What the crew did not yet fully understand was that the man they had removed was not an ordinary passenger in any sense. He wasn't just someone traveling from one destination to another. He was deeply connected to the aviation world itself. A highly trained pilot, respected in professional circles, someone who had spent years in the exact kind of aircraft they were now operating. A person who understood airline procedures, safety protocols, and cockpit-level decision-making far better than most people on board that flight. And yet, none of that had been considered in the moment he was questioned. As the aircraft continued cruising at altitude, a quiet process had already begun behind the scenes. One of the senior crew members discreetly rechecked the passenger manifest. Something about the situation was bothering them more and more. This wasn't just about a seating misunderstanding anymore. It felt procedural, sensitive, the kind of issue that could escalate if not reviewed properly. A small notification was sent through internal communication channels to confirm details that should have already been clear. That was the first crack. Because on the ground, at the airline's operations side, something unusual appeared on the system logs. A flagged note regarding the removal of a certified aviation professional from a premium cabin. At first, it looked like a minor customer service incident. But then the details loaded. The name, the credentials, the role, and suddenly the situation stopped being routine. There was a pause in the system review room. The kind of pause that happens when people realize they are no longer dealing with a simple complaint. Because the man who had been asked to leave his seat was not just a passenger with a ticket. He was someone with authority in the same world the airline depended on to function safely every single day. Within minutes, internal messaging escalated upward, from operations staff to senior management, from senior management to airline executives. And finally, one message reached the desk that changed everything: the CEO's office. At first, the CEO's reaction was simple disbelief. Mistakes happen in airlines all the time, but this was different. The details were too specific, too sensitive, and too damaging if mishandled. He requested immediate verification. Names were cross-checked, flight numbers were confirmed. Passenger credentials were reviewed again, more carefully this time. And with every passing minute, the situation became clearer and worse. Because the truth was unavoidable. A trained pilot, someone with deep ties to aviation operations, had been publicly removed from first class based on suspicion rather than fact. There was no security threat, no procedural violation, only perception. And perception, in this case, had already triggered action. On board the aircraft, the crew remained unaware of how far the situation had already escalated on the ground. They were still operating under the assumption that this was a minor seating correction that would be forgotten by the end of the flight. But in reality, the airline's leadership was now fully engaged in reviewing what had just happened. And as they dug deeper, another realization began to surface. This wasn't just a mistake in judgment. It was a breakdown in process. A moment where assumption replaced verification. A moment where authority was applied without certainty. And worst of all, it involved someone who understood exactly how serious that kind of mistake could become. Back on the aircraft, the flight continued normally on the surface, but underneath that normality, something irreversible had already started. Information was moving faster than the plane itself now. Reports were being written. Calls were being prepared. Accountability was being traced step by step back to the moment the decision was made. And in the middle of all this, the CEO finally saw the full profile of the man who had been removed. For a few seconds, he said nothing, because now he understood what everyone else on that flight did not. This was not a routine passenger dispute. This was a decision that had crossed a very dangerous line. And by the time anyone on board realized the truth, the CEO had already made a call that would change everything that came next. The message reached the CEO's desk like a quiet warning that carried far too much weight. At first, he didn't react. He simply read it again, slower this time, as if repeating the words might somehow change their meaning. But it didn't. The facts remained the same. A certified pilot, someone deeply connected to the aviation world, had been removed from a first-class seat based on assumption rather than verified procedure. And now, the airline was staring at a situation that could no longer be treated as a simple misunderstanding. Inside the operations room, tension quietly spread as more details were confirmed. The CEO requested a full breakdown of everything that had happened from the moment boarding began. Every decision, every communication, every name involved. What initially looked like a small customer service issue was now being reconstructed as a chain of avoidable judgments. And with each layer uncovered, the seriousness of the mistake became more difficult to ignore. Then came the part that changed the entire atmosphere. The identity of the man was fully confirmed. He wasn't just any pilot. He was a highly respected aviation professional with years of experience, someone whose expertise was recognized in serious aviation circles. A person who understood aircraft operations at a level that went far beyond passenger interaction. And more importantly, someone whose presence on that flight should have immediately commanded respect, not suspicion. The CEO leaned back in silence, because now it was no longer about one flight. It was about reputation. It was about judgment. And it was about how quickly perception had replaced verification inside his own airline system. On board the aircraft, the crew still had no idea how far things had escalated on the ground. To them, the situation had already ended when the passenger left the seat. But what they didn't realize was that the decision had already triggered a chain reaction that was now moving faster than the plane itself. Internal reports were being finalized. Senior management was reviewing accountability. And the CEO was no longer asking what happened. He was asking, how did we allow this to happen? Within minutes, a formal directive was issued from headquarters. A full internal investigation would be launched immediately after landing. Every staff member involved in the incident would be required to submit statements. Training protocols would be reviewed. And most importantly, the airline would have to publicly address a situation that was now at risk of becoming a reputational crisis. But the most powerful moment came when the CEO personally requested a message to be delivered to the flight crew before landing. Not an order, not a warning, but a clear acknowledgement that something had gone wrong at the highest level of customer handling. The tone was firm, but controlled. Because by now, it was no longer about punishment. It was about responsibility. As the aircraft continued its journey, a quiet realization began to settle over the airline's leadership. This wasn't just a mistake made by one or two staff members. It was a reflection of a deeper issue. A system where assumptions could override verification, where appearance could influence judgment, and where even a trained aviation professional could be treated as someone who didn't belong. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all remained calm. He did not demand attention. He did not escalate the situation. He did not turn the incident into confrontation. But in doing so, he had unintentionally exposed something far larger than a seating error. He had exposed how fragile judgment can become when bias replaces procedure, even in environments built on discipline and safety. As the plane began its descent, the weight of the situation had fully shifted. What had started as a quiet removal from a seat had now become a corporate-level crisis. And somewhere in the middle of it, the CEO understood a difficult truth. Some mistakes don't happen because of lack of rules, but because rules are ignored in moments where assumptions feel easier than asking questions. By the time the aircraft touched down, decisions had already been made at the highest level. Accountability would follow, procedures would change, and consequences would reach far beyond the cabin itself. Because now everyone understood one thing clearly. It wasn't just a passenger who had been removed that day. It was judgment itself that had failed.